Alternate Realities has been gone for over 5 years, but our community lasts forever. And now, in these dark times, the AR signal lights up the night sky, and the old gang is ready to answer the call as we celebrate a year's worth of holidays together. This is the LongAR Halloween. Welcome to the LongAR Halloween, a My Comic Shop history tale. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. This is part 3, Christmas, and I am joined by the spirit of friendship and fun, Rich Roney.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome, sir. So let's just get right into this. We have some breaking news. So we were going to record this a week ago, and we were all set, but we ran into some technical difficulties, and we decided to push our recording a week. And in the interim, we actually had I would say a relatively major development within the world of alternate realities. Now, rather than I try to give context and paint a picture and set the table and all that, what happened? Can you share with our listeners what transpired?
Yes. Our joint friend, great friend, Steve Otto, sold 150 long boxes to a purchaser from, I believe it's a retired police officer from Albany, but he unloaded 150 boxes in one fell swoop, which is a big move.
Yeah, for sure. So, so for longtime listeners, right? Like, we've talked about this many times over the past 5 years that I've been doing this podcast. And it's also documented on film in My Comic Shop country. But for anyone who needs a quick refresher, when Alternate Realities closed in 2015, Steve took his remaining inventory, again, which he did not blow out during the store's final days. He took his remaining inventory and he's been storing them, storing all of his products in initially 3 and then 2 large units at a Westies warehouse. And he's been slowly, selling everything off via eBay. So that's what he's been up to. Whenever people ask, like, oh, what did Steve do with everything? What has Steve been doing? That's what he's been doing. He's been selling off the remaining inventory that he's been storing in these warehouse units via eBay. And so, you shared with everyone what just happened, and I'll go a step further. So a few days ago, as of our recording, Steve posted on Facebook, and this is what he said. And I did not have any heads up that he was going to do this, so I found out when I read this Facebook post. Steve wrote, "A long time ago, they used to say, SCO will never close alternate realities, until one day he did. Then they said, SCO will never live long enough to get rid of all the comics in the warehouse, until one day he did. That's it, kids. Alternate Realities has no more comics. All gone. Silver Age, Bronze Age, Modern Age, every X-Men, Batman, Superman, Avengers, Justice League, small publishers, kids titles, every retailer incentive." And then he says below are before and after photos. And he closes it by saying, "End of an era." And, inevitably, many people, started commenting and reacting, and a good number of people clicked the sad react button on Facebook. And I have to say, I was the two emotions that I was feeling. One was surprise, not total shock, because he and I have had conversations at various points over the years about, potentially blowing everything out, or not even blowing everything out, but, unloading everything to a wholesaler or another store or something like that. So I knew that this was something that he had at least entertained to some extent. So I wasn't like gobsmacked. I was a little surprised that he had taken the step, right? So I was a little surprised, not shocked, but a little surprised. But more than anything, and I think this is something you and I share, I was relieved and happy for him that he doesn't have all of those comics weighing him down anymore.
Yes. You and Bill and I all share. I mean, I called him and I sent him an email and I said, congratulations, really heartfelt congratulations. I think over the past couple of years, he's become more and more concerned about the time it would take to sell these piecemeal or to sell them in small increments, just how time consuming that would have been. And I also think he was concerned that, God forbid, something happened to him, the burden it might place on his son to to unload those things. So heartfelt congratulations. My sense would be this wasn't an easy decision, because we've spoken about this. Steve loves comics, and he also loves the whole process of, organizing and alphabetizing and putting them in numerical order and getting a sense for what's there. So kudos to him. Good move. I congratulate him. I am intrigued. I know I sent him an email. He sent me a note back that there was a small hiccup, and then he put one of those, not smiley faces, but really a face that was beet red and steam was coming out of the ears. So I'm sure something didn't go according to plan. But listen, there's a after picture and they're vacant back issue bins. Heartfelt congratulations. Good, well done.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. And I have not spoken to him directly. I commented on his Facebook post. I told him I'm looking forward to hearing the full story, and perhaps that's something that we'll have that happen on the podcast at some point in the future. And I did text him, and I just said congratulations. I did not hear back, but I texted him congrats. And I do want to say real quick though, because in his post he said that people said that he would never live long enough to sell everything, and I guess I do.
Actually, I think he's the one that said that more than anyone else.
Probably. And I guess if I ever did say that, or if I ever did feel it, it was only in the context of him selling everything one comic at a time, or one statue at a time, or one trade paperback at a time on eBay. Just given the volume of stuff that he had, it's at that rate, as much as to his credit, he, even now, because again, the comics are gone, but he still has all of the trades and toys and statues and supplies. He's not done, but the comics themselves are gone. But then and now, he has literally hundreds of eBay listings up. So he has been selling, but again, when he's listing, a book at a time or something like that, it's just, you do the math and it's sort of how is he ever going to finish?
Yeah. No, kudos to him. I don't know how this came about. I don't know how he learned of this retired police sergeant, or how this guy learned about Steve. I just forget the connection points. I think you and I have chatted for a while that we always thought that he might give Ben from Zap Comics a call, and because I think years ago, Steve blew out all the back issues, sold them to Ben years ago. And Ben's the only guy I can think of that has the scale to take on something of that size and make it work, unloaded it at conventions and stuff like that. Ben would have been my first thought. But I'm happy for Steve. I think this is a weight off his shoulders, and kudos to him for pulling the trigger on the decision.
Yeah, for sure. And, like I said, I am curious to get more of the story from him. Like I said, I'm very excited. I'm curious because, Steve he's not been shy about this. I mean, he shared it, on these podcasts. He has or had in his mind, a sense of what he would want for all of these things, what he considered the value of these things to be. And so, if he found someone who, met him halfway or matched him or whatever it is, I'm glad that it worked out. I'm curious, to kind of, like you said, hear more about how this came to be. I will share two thoughts, and I said this to Bill. I called you, and I didn't get you immediately. I left you a voicemail, and then I called Bill right after. And I said this to Bill, and then I said this to you, and I'm going to say it again now. The two thoughts that that came to mind, other than surprise and relief, were one, at the time I didn't know if this was a step toward actually divesting himself of one of the units at Westie's, and obviously that's not the case. He still has plenty of stuff, and our understanding is that some of the stuff that he has at his house will now make its way over to the unit. But for a brief moment, I said this might be a step toward getting rid of one of the units, and I said, what a dark day at Westie's. Because when we did our episode, last year, or at the beginning of this year, right, we called it Westie's best customer, and we've joked about how he's their top customer, and they must love him there because he's had these large units for 5 years, and he's a great customer, right? Like he's nice and he's, you know, he's clean and he doesn't give them any issues or anything like that. And so I just had this image of the Westies workers like seeing all of these boxes leaving and them just saying to themselves what do you think he's doing? Like, do you think he's going to bring them back?
or really like the manager going in the back room and breaking out his files and going, I got to change next year's projections.
I know, and I'm thinking it's like right at the end of the year, like this is really going to screw them up. There goes
my year-end bonus.
And then the other thought that I had was going back to that episode that you, me, and Steve did really early on in 2020, before the pandemic, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right, yeah. Where, you know, the Alternate Realities was preparing to be a vendor at Undiscovered Realm Comic-Con, which, of course, because of the pandemic, could not happen, and, you know, so it goes. But I said to myself, because, you know, people, I guess, have been asking, like, you know, will Steve, whenever the convention is ultimately able to occur, will Steve be a vendor as he was originally planning? And, you know, Bill and I actually talked about this in the first episode of the LongAR Halloween, where we felt, before we knew he sold all this stuff, right? We said, we feel like that window has kind of closed. Like there was a moment in time where Steve was open to being a vendor and he signed up and he was going to do it. But it just seemed like he got his out and he wasn't going to revisit it. And now, now that he sold, so that was the other thought that I had. I'm like, I feel like he sold everything because he's like, this way, those guys will never ask me again about doing another show. I sold all the comics.
Yeah. In some ways, you can never, this is contradictory. In some ways, you can always predict how Steve will react. But then you can also never predict how he'll react. And, you know, you're speaking about the LongAR Halloween. Another tradition we have is getting together New Year's Day and having our brunch. And I think that's where this whole idea about Steve participating in a convention in Westchester County, specifically at the county center, all evolved. And, you know, even Bill was prepared to fly in and work the convention. I think you might have even had some literature prepared or pictures, you know, just working the table, working the table with SCO.
Yeah, I mean, I commissioned. It's actually, no, you can't. Where is it? Oh, it's actually like right behind. It's literally right behind. We're FaceTiming right now, and it's literally behind my head, so you can't see it.
Okay.
Or if I turn, maybe you can see it. You can see it a little bit. So yes. I commissioned a piece of art from Chris Giarusso, and he drew SCO and myself behind the table.
Weren't you doing the salute?
Yeah, we were doing the salute, and we were holding the AR sign, and that was the artwork that I used to promote that Homecoming miniseries of my comic shop history, which ended up getting aborted, you know, 2 episodes in because of the pandemic. But yeah, like we were all set. And I mean, that's not to say, you know, he could still do a convention with the stuff that he has left, the trades and the merchandise and stuff like that. Again, I would be very, very surprised if he did. Like if you're an Alternate Realities fan out there and you're saying, oh, I hope Steve does a show. Like I would, to borrow one of your phrases, Rich, like I wouldn't bet the ranch on that. Like don't hold your breath. You never know, but I doubt it.
You never know. Yeah. Yeah. Boy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm speechless. I can't predict either way.
So, and I guess one last quick Steve update. So, you know, he still, as has been discussed, he still has his Diamond account and he still gets the Diamond order form and he still orders each month, I think just enough to sort of keep the account open. And I think he's ordering things that he himself is interested in. I don't know. He might be ordering some stuff for friends. I'm not positive. But he posted a photo of the latest catalog and as he was going through it. And I'm trying to see if I can pull it up on his Facebook page. Let me see. Bear with me for a moment here. He posts a lot, so it's not always easy to find exactly what you're looking for. I don't want to waste people's time, but I commented. No, go ahead.
Isn't it more difficult now that DC is spun off from Diamond? I mean, it must be more difficult to hit the minimum to maintain the account if you can't tap into the DC merchandise.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine he did not acknowledge that specifically, but I would imagine. But when he posted this photo of the order form, I commented and I said, my prediction is by mid 2021, we'll see another Facebook post of an empty kitchen table, and he'll write, "You thought I wouldn't close the store, and then I did. You thought I wouldn't sell the comics, then I did. You thought I'd never close my Diamond account. Well, it finally happened."
Yeah.
So, and I guess that's sort of been a little bit of a lesson. I don't know, for myself, for all of us, right? Because especially with the closing of the store, we've talked about this so many times, but right, like it was that ever-present threat of like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not going to renew the lease. And nobody ever believed it. And then he finally did. So, I'll give him this. I mean, he's taken some steps in these past few years that I wouldn't have necessarily expected.
Yes. One other thing. I think, Anthony, it was about a year and a half ago, possibly. Bill came into town.
Yeah.
You still lived off North Broadway. And I remember I came in for like a Wednesday, and you assembled Steve, myself, Bill, and yourself. But I remember one of the things, we joked about is, how do you get Steve to do something? You tell him he can't do it. And he is so ornery and stubborn and tenacious and defiant. You tell him he can't do it, oh, that's like putting a big red flag in front of a bull.
For sure. So, all right, we've talked about Steve enough. Let's talk about you.
Okay.
And one thing in particular, well, a few things, but I want to start with this. So, in selecting the AR alumni for this LongAR Halloween event and assigning each of you to a different holiday for these various episodes, they're not random. Like I do put some thought into it. For example, Roby was on our last episode, Thanksgiving, because he's become quite the chef. And I felt like the food tie-in, made sense to kind of have him on there for Thanksgiving. So the reason I wanted to have you on for the Christmas episode or our holiday episode, it's not just Christmas, right? Whatever you happen to celebrate, we wish everyone, a happy holiday. But the reason why I wanted you on for the Christmas episode was you and I met Christmas 2002 at Alternate Realities. We met the week between Christmas and New Year's.
Yep.
And can you explain why you were there? What was the tradition that you used to follow when the store was open during that time of year?
No, thank you for the question. Let me answer it, but let me also make a commentary about our first meeting, so to speak. So for your listeners, I'm not going to mention the name of my employer, but for years and years and years, I traveled. Certain years, I traveled 45 weeks of the year, and I would basically open offices or close offices or consolidate work between offices. So I saw a lot of airports. I saw a lot of hotel rooms, a lot of car rental places. But the work always slowed down at year end. It was kind of, for our whole business unit, the understanding was, look, the last 2 weeks of the year, there's no travel. And I would always use, the pressure was off. I really couldn't do anything the week of the holidays. So it started out, I would go in, whatever the Wednesday, or as close to the delivery of content and the sale of content, I would go in and just hang out in the store. And I saw, it was really super relaxing. I mean, I didn't have to, get up, put my suit on, the tie and all that. I could just roll out of bed, have a cup of coffee, and then all of us, we gravitate at the store. Now, when I first started doing it, that was really the era when Brandon and Drew and Steve and Mike Kaplan were all joint owners. Prem was very involved. Tom Doherty was one of the workers there. So I would start going in, usually the sale day, and just spend the day. And it became like an event. Okay, Brandon would come in, or Bill would come in. We'd go out and get lunch, or we there were times Brandon and he was going to buy a collection. We'd go look at it. It was just very spontaneous. Later in time, this was under your supervision, but later in time, I would also come in and you had started the theme sales. You know, there was the Burn Notice Day, there was the white collar sale. So this was a tradition I had. I'd say, Anthony, it probably on the order of 18 or 20 years. I did it. Now, the other thing, I do vividly remember meeting you because, as you know, one of my favorite characters is Green Lantern. Hal Jordan and Alan Scott, but I was really devastated when they made Hal Jordan go crazy and become a villain. And you know, from the time I was 8 and 9 years old, he was one of my favorite characters. And then I just thought it was just done very poorly because it was super abrupt, where they had him go crazy and become a killer and just, you know, turn his back on, you know, 40 years of history. It drove me nuts. But there was an issue that came out. I think it was JLA Spectre Soul War or something like that. Now, I remember you had started at the store, and I remember before I met you, I would come in and Steve would have little tags up, Anthony's pick of the week. So even before I shook hands with you, there were certain things that I would pick up and contemplate buying based on your recommendation, your digest of it, and hey, here, I think this is good. But I remember I was super excited for the JLA Spectre Soul War, and you very graciously kind of chided me and say, you know, just, you were super diplomatic, but you kind of said, you know, to use my words, Rich, I wouldn't bet the ranch on that. You know, you might not want to buy it. And I remember I perused it real quickly and I decided not to buy it, which was a good thing, but it crushed me because I was hoping this would be an incremental step in his redemption as a character. Now, later in time, it did happen with, you know, Alex Ross and others. You know, there was a lot of pushback on making Hal a villain. You know, there was, I think, something called Heat. Alex Ross was very involved in that. And there was a lot of fan pushback on that whole action. And ultimately, over time, they did bring him back as a hero. Sorry, got long-winded there. Sorry about that.
No, you hit on a lot of stuff that I want to pick up on here. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I remember our first meeting. What's funny to me, and I was thinking about this, is that I started working at Alternate Realities the summer before, summer 2002. It was after my freshman year of high school. And yet, I didn't meet you until that winter. And the reason, you know, we've talked about this on the show, was, you know, I was very shy. And so, you know, again, you would come in during the week, that one time of year, but normally your routine was to come in on Saturdays. And, you know, every week that I was working there over the summer, whether it was Steve or Bill, you know, someone would always say, hey, like, why don't you come out to dinner with us on Saturday? And again, it was really just shyness, and I always politely declined. But as a result, sadly, it delayed our meeting until that winter. But I distinctly remember, you know, we were breaking down the shipment. We were towards the front of the store. I think it was set up, you know, a little bit differently than it was later on. But I remember being at the front of the store, and I remember meeting you. And yes, I remember that conversation about JLA Spectre Soul War. It was for anyone not, and actually most people are probably not familiar with this. It's a 2-part prestige format miniseries written by J.M. DeMatteis and drawn by Darryl Banks. And again, it came out winter 2002. And I had read, there was a site that I used to go to all the time.
Oh yeah.
The Fourth Rail.
Fourth Rail
was a comics review site, and they were great. And I found that, I guess, my interests were kind, my tastes were kind of aligned with their site. And so I came to really put a lot of stock in their reviews. And I remember like the night before, I had seen a review of Soul War, and they had given it, I think, a 1 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10 at most. And so when you mentioned that you were interested in that, and again, it was funny because I was thinking about this in advance of today. It's like, you know, I guess kind of ballsy on my part, where it's like, I've just met you. You're like, I'm so excited for this comic. And I'm like, you don't want to read that.
And Anthony, to interrupt you, right? That was 18 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? And I can remember it like it was yesterday. But I do remember just kind of the chiding, and the hesitancy to go like, but basically you were telling me, look, I really don't think you're going to enjoy that. I think it's going to be a bit of a letdown. You were super diplomatic, but it's emblazed in my brain. I was so excited for that. And I thought, oh God, finally they're going to redeem him as a character, and he's going to reawaken his friendships with the Justice League, and this will get things on track. I didn't know what a train wreck that thing was. I mean, in retrospect, I don't think I've ever read the whole thing. And I do like, I hope I'm saying it right, DeMatteis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of his work on with Keith Giffen on the Justice League, I thought was superb. I do know DeMatteis can get very, on occasion, philosophical or metaphysical. Some of his work later on time on The Spectre, I loved, but it's almost borderline Vertigo in some ways. But I'm just thrilled Jeff Johns came along and got things on track.
I want to circle back to Hal Jordan in a moment, but in advance of today, I was saying to myself, because we've, for people who have listened to all of these episodes, like we've told our meeting story before, and I was saying to myself, I'm like, what new dimension could we possibly find? Like, what could I possibly add? And I said to myself, you know what? As much as, I read that review of Soul War and I, it kept you from buying it, I've never read the story. And I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to read it. I'm going to read JLA Spectre Soul War. And I'll be honest, I had a little bit of fear because I said to myself, could you imagine what if it was like this great story and I steered Rich away from it? And meanwhile, he would have loved it. But I said, I was like, all right, I'm going to read it. And this way it'll give me something to talk about. And, whenever we do these podcasts, right, like we're never out to disparage, anyone's work or anything like that. And with DeMatteis in particular, there's other stuff of his that I've read that I've really enjoyed. I will be completely honest. I couldn't even finish the first issue.
Oh, thank God. I have not read it. So you would have been one up on me. But we've said this also with our admiration of writers and artists and creators. At least they took a chance. They tried to do something. And there's always that dynamic of how much is an instruction from editorial or management versus how much is the purely the work of the creator. Yeah, I'm kind of relieved that your conclusion is what it was, because if you had told me, you know what, Rich, I was wrong. They knocked it out of the park. You'd really enjoy this.
Yeah. And so thankfully I didn't have to really invest much because both issues are on the DC app. So I was able to just kind of, pull them up digitally. And, the basic premise of it is that there's an interdimensional force known as the Trans, which I don't think that name would really play today, but this was almost 20 years ago. And anyway, this force is able to basically feed upon people's fears and make them manifest. That's sort of like the general premise of it. And so it's the Spectre teaming up with the Justice League. And, it's funny, as far as that fear that I had, that it was actually a good story that I kept you from all these years. The opening pages are actually okay. Like, there's this series of a series of scenes where Hal Jordan, the Spectre, is approaching each of the Justice League members and helping them in battle. And as he approaches them, he is reflecting on each of them and his relationship with them. So like he has some commentary about Superman and then about Batman. And those few pages were actually kind of interesting. And that was where that fear was really creeping in. And I'm like, oh, this is actually not bad. And then it kind of goes from there, and just it did not hold my interest. I got most of the way through before I kind of tapped out, and I did not read the second issue. So I stand by my original advice, I guess.
No, Anthony, I remember vividly where we were standing, where the book was, and then just your counsel. So.
But, I wanted to talk about Hal Jordan because, it's funny because like you and I talk comics a decent amount, but not as much as people might think. And we've always talked about this as far as, you know, the dinners and just hanging out at the store. It's like, yeah, there was comic talk, but it's not like that's all we talked about, right? And so, you know, we've touched on the Hal Jordan stuff over the years, but we've never podcasted about it. And I was kind of curious, like, what it was like to go through that as a fan of the character at that time, because I was really reflecting on this, and I said to myself, you know, during that period of time in the 90s, most of the major DC characters were replaced for some period of time. Now, in the case of, you know, Superman with the 4 replacement Supermen during Reign, you know, following the death, with respect to Batman and Nightfall with Azrael taking over, with respect to Wonder Woman when Artemis, you know, won the mantle for a period of time. In those cases, you know, I think it was understood by all parties, you know, fans and publishers, that this was a short-term thing. Like, I don't know that anyone really thought like, oh, this is it, you know, for forever. And each of those stories lasted, I mean, for Superman and Batman, about a year. I forget how long the Wonder Woman thing was, but roughly that same amount of time. Then, as we move through the DC universe, you have, you know, the Flash and Green Arrow cases where, you know, Wally West assumed the mantle after Barry died in Crisis, and Connor Hawke assumed the mantle of Green Arrow after Oliver died. And in those cases, you know, those two characters, they carried, you know, the mantle for years. I mean, in Wally's case, decades.
Yes.
So in those cases, you know, those clearly were not envisioned as, you know, a short-term story. Like, that was something that DC committed to for a good amount of time. But in those cases, both Barry and Ollie went out heroes, right? Like, they left behind a heroic legacy. So I say all of that leading up to this, you know, with Hal Jordan, it's like that must have been exceptionally difficult, because it wasn't something that, you know, it wasn't short-term, and he went out a villain. So it was like you really had this 1-2 punch. I mean, what was that like at the time?
And I'm even processing it now in response to your question. To your point, right? And I'm kind of setting aside Connor with Green Arrow and Wally with the Flash. But again, Barry and Ollie went out as heroes. And then also with the big 3, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, always in the back of my mind, look, the primary character is going to come back. This is kind of just a spark to generate more sales or to get some media attention. The sad thing with, you know, if I may, Hal was just on the cusp where I think it would have cheapened their strategy to, you know, have him replaced and then a year later bring him back. The thing that annoyed me, and it still annoys me to this day, one, I have tremendous love for the character. I mean, like I said, when I was 8 and 9 and 10, and the books were 12 cents, finding them was difficult. They didn't have stores the way, I mean, you know, I was at the mercy of either a newsstand or a pharmacy that might have the spinner rack. But I had a great love for the character. I loved Gil Kane, the artist. I loved John Broome and Gardner Fox, the writers. More John Broome, the science stories. The whole mythos of, you know, this whole, intergalactic police force and the rings and the oaths. I loved it. I ate it up. It was like a 1965 version of Star Wars in some ways with the Force. I loved it. But then and you're probably more laser focused, or you know the statistics better than me, but there was that fight with Mongol and then the cyborg Superman, and the city that Hal lived in was destroyed in that battle. And then immediately in the next issue, he goes crazy. So I thought what angered me a lot was what they did ran absolutely contrary to like 37 years of history with the character. Just to have him fall to pieces, go evil, kill some of his other Green Lanterns, basically destroy the great power battery on Oa. It was totally at odds. It seemed almost super abrupt. And then I also think, quite frankly, there was a big issue of how I think he killed Sinestro. And then there was a filler issue, the following issue, with a kind of a shelf a story with team up with Green Arrow, and then they introduced Kyle and Emerald Twilight. So it was just so disjointed and just so abrupt, and it ran foreign and absolutely contrary to the character that I had known for 37 years or something like that.
I understand. I have some more thoughts and questions for you, but let's take a real quick commercial break, and then we'll pick our conversation right back up in just a second. Submissions are now open for the March season of the Brightside Tavern Film Festival in Jersey City, New Jersey. Visit filmfreeway.com to submit your film now. Also, be sure to listen to the podcasts hosted by the festival's organizer, CJ Cullen. You can find the official Hang On to Your Shorts podcast, as well as the Cullen on Film podcast, via a shared universe network. The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. And as always, we appreciate the sponsorship of those folks. So we were talking about, Hal Jordan and his turn, and yeah, you mentioned the sequence of events, and I guess there are a couple of things that I was thinking about. So first of all, let me say this. I was just getting into comics at this time, right? I started with Death of Superman, and so I was reading the Superman books from 92 into 93 when this was all happening. And I did read the issue of Green Lantern where Coast City is, or actually I should have double checked this, but I think the actual destruction happens in the pages of one of the Superman books, and then they pick up with it in the issue of Green Lantern, which I read, because there was, I think it was Green Lantern 47 or somewhere around there that tied directly into Reign of the Superman. So I read that issue.
And his arm was injured, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, like I had a sense, obviously of who Green Lantern was, and I knew Coast City was destroyed, but I wasn't, I didn't follow along with Green Lantern after that, in the immediate aftermath. So I was not clocking like anything that was going on with Green Lantern at the time. As the 90s went on, I guess I was exposed to Kyle primarily through JLA, and then that was probably at the point where I was starting to maybe go back and read a bit about what had happened. I forget the exact order of things for me, but the point is, like, I was really oblivious to what was going on with Hal at this point in time. But I was thinking about the fact that the precipitating event for his turn, was the destruction of Coast City, which, happened as part of a Superman event. Like, it wasn't even his own storyline. Yeah. And the fact that Emerald Twilight itself, because I did eventually track down these single issues. I had them in my collection for a while. Green Lantern 48, 49, 50, the Emerald Twilight storyline. 3 issues was all it took for him to turn, and maybe that's more a product of the times, because it's like today that would be a year-long storyline or at least 6 issues. Like the fact that it happened so quickly, but as a reader, it must have given you whiplash, right? Like to see the turn happen that fast.
Oh God, yeah. I used the word abrupt, and Anthony, I don't remember the particulars. Was issue 51 the first one where Kyle is really introduced?
Yeah. I think it's it's the final pages of 50 where he gets the ring, and but 51 is like the one with Kyle on the cover, like that iconic cover of Kyle in action as Green Lantern.
Right.
Was there, like, how long? Because I was wondering about this. We talked about, with these other replacements along the way during that period of time, like kind of having a sense that these were short term. With Hal, I mean, at what point did it sink in that, this is not a temporary storyline. This is not a Nightfall situation. Like, this is the long haul. Like when did that happen for you?
Oh, well, before I answer that, one thing I got to say, the unusual thing, they didn't put replacements. When you think about John Stewart and Guy Gardner, And there was a brief period of time, I think, in the late 80s where John Stewart was the primary Green Lantern. And then Hal came back, right? And with that intergalactic police force, yeah, you can have multiple Green Lanterns, multiple police officers, so to speak. But I really had the sense from the get-go, from the absolute beginning, that this is not good. This is not going to be, hey, Azrael steps in, and, coincidentally, 12 months later, Bruce comes back. I never had that sense. It just seemed so, like you said, you get whiplash, right? But it seems so contrary to the whole premise of the character. And I kind of got sharper with the math. I think it was 33 or 34 years of history. That just seemed absolutely contrary to the way the personality behaved and how heroic he was and his actions and the things he faced. So really, I was disappointed. I do think Ron Mars, I believe, was the writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what sort of strategic direction he got, but they quit. He had the attitude a la Highlander. There can be only one. So they really pushed the whole mythos absolutely out of the picture. No more central power battery, no more Guardians, no other Green Lanterns. They were all murdered, killed, etc., etc. There was only one, the Green Lantern. I do think Ron Mars did the same thing with the Silver Surfer a couple of years later. But to your point, it was more protracted and prolonged. They had this kind of incremental descent into... I didn't read it, so I only know it through like Newsarama or CBR, but he kind of went over to the dark side. But it was more protracted. It wasn't as abrupt as what we saw in just a couple of issues.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, do you think there's any version of the story that could have been told, whether it was told in a different way or told over more issues, where you would have bought into it, where you would have said, okay, I mean, let's keep the basic premise, right? Coast City, his home is destroyed, millions of people killed. He goes to the Guardians. He wants the power to bring them back, essentially, to save the city. They deny him that, and that's when he goes rogue. I mean, is there any way that you could kind of take the bones of that? Like, do you think there's any story that could have been told that you would have been on board for, where you would have said, you know what, I get it. I get why he's going down this road.
Oh, well, to that point, I'm going to leap, and I'm famous for non sequiturs.
Quite all right.
I really think Marv Wolfman did a magnificent job in Crisis on Infinite Earths when he let Barry go out as a hero. I would have enjoyed it more if Hal had died, fighting Mongol, or immersed in this and sacrificed himself. Make it a death a la Barry, where he goes out a hero. But then the other thing that I think that's interesting is if you look at all the stuff that transpired after that, like I said, a lot of fans reacted. Mm-hmm. To your point, I'm not an extrovert, but there were a lot of letter writing campaigns and communications. And then if you look at what happened for a short period of time, they did have some stories where Hal got, as Parallax, he got peace and he kind of went into a dream world for a little bit. And then they kind of kicked that to the curb. And then they effectively had him redeem himself in Final Night, mm-hmm. When he kind of like reignited the sun.
I don't mean to interrupt, but a real quick plug for listeners. I'm going to be covering the Final Night on a special holiday edition of my Superman show, Digging for Kryptonite. That'll be out on December 23rd. So we're going to be covering Final Night, which is one of the first like DC crossovers that I ever read. So it holds a special place for me. But I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, Hal redeems himself. He defeats the Sun Eater and reignites the sun at the end of that miniseries. And
sacrifices him. Yeah. And I think there was Green Lantern issue number 81 or something. There was like a memorial mm-hmm. or an honorarium to him, and all the other heroes appreciated his sacrifice. And then later on, Jeff Johns brought him back. What was it, Day of Judgment?
Yeah,
where they effectively had Hal become the successor, the host body to the Spectre. So there was all these actions. To me, the only way it would have been palatable to me would be if he were able to die in a similar fashion the way Barry Allen died.
Right. No, I get it. And, your point is well taken as far as, it wasn't just Hal. I mean, Hal bore the brunt of it, but it was, they really did strip away all of these elements of the Green Lantern mythology. And, I don't know, it might've been the sort of thing at that point where either they were out of ideas or sales were declining and they felt like they really needed to do something to shake things up. But I mean, you're right. I mean, in terms of, doing away with the Guardians and the rest of the Corps, I mean, they really, like we were saying, really stripped away so much of, what they would ultimately bring back, so obviously everything goes in cycles, right? And when we got Green Lantern Rebirth, it wasn't just the rebirth of Hal Jordan. It was the rebirth of all of these other concepts, but for that decade, I'm sure that was tough to be a fan.
Oh, listen, as I said, and you know what it's like, your affinity for Superman and, the image you saw at Heroes World, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, reading about Green Lantern when I was like 8 years old and just going with the character, from the early 1960s all the way up through the early 90s. I think this was around 93, I think possibly when this happened. But I do think DC kind of shot themselves in the foot because I think it would have been better received today. But just after, kind of the relaunch with Man of Steel, and shortly thereafter, there was Batman Year One, right? But after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and just about the same point in time when they did, John Byrne did Man of Steel, they had Oliver Queen, Ray Palmer, and Green Lantern all be heroes. They kind of acknowledged their normal age. So, Hal had the white walls. Ray Palmer was likewise an older hero. Ollie was in his 44. I know one of the stories, the Longbow Hunters referenced his birthday and his age. I think at that time in the late 80s, when you effectively made Green Lantern a guy with the gray hair and the white on the side, a la Reed Richards, I don't think it attracted young readers. I think that was, what is it Stan Lee said, everyone, the first comic they buy, there's the first issue for everyone. But when you know it and I know it, that entry point, when you start reading the character in your first issue, that holds a real interesting place in terms of passion and loyalty and excitement. So Hal Jordan was my Green Lantern. I do know on one of the book clubs that Mike San Gregorio quarterbacks, Artie Mulford, spoke about Kyle as his Green Lantern. That's who he joined with. And I can certainly relate to that. I just think they were too kind of myopic and tactical. I don't think they really thought this through the way, obviously when you look at the backlash from fans and how, as you said, everything goes in cycles. Everything they decimated in the early 90s, they brought back with Jeff Johns in Green Lantern Rebirth.
Yeah, and I guess I'm in the same camp as Artie. I mean, for me, again, I had exposure to Hal in like the Reign of the Superman storyline, but then it's funny, like I really knew him more as a villain. He was the antagonist, revealed to be the main antagonist in Zero Hour. And then, he redeemed himself in Final Night, but even there was still so much tension with him and the rest of the Justice League. And then, of course, becoming the Spectre in Day of Judgment. But then, even there was still always that tension, the tension there. And so, especially reading JLA, Morrison's JLA, that was when I really got acquainted with Kyle. I came to be a fan of Hal. honestly, through Final Night and Day of Judgment, like I was on board for those storylines, but especially with Green Lantern Rebirth, I really loved what Jeff Johns did in that storyline, and that kind of made me a fan of the character. But yeah, I mean, I guess ultimately I would fall into that camp of Kyle being the Green Lantern. Certainly that I had the earliest and most sustained exposure to, but. Yeah, it's a tough thing. And I know you and I have talked about this in different contexts with different characters, but, for all of us, whoever our favorite character is, there are certain qualities that, are so indelible. And when you see those changed, it can be kind of tough. I mean, I guess I've been kind of lucky as a Superman fan, I guess because he's such an icon and DC has so much, at stake with that character that maybe they don't ever take him like so far afield of what, I guess the classic interpretation is. I mean, even in the 90s, like when he had the different powers and costume and all that stuff, again, there too, I don't think anyone thought like, oh, we're never going to see the classic costume again. I would say probably the closest thing that I experienced with Superman to what you experienced with Hal Jordan would be the New 52, where, in this version, his relationship with Lois is gone. His parents are dead. Like that was so counter to the version of the character I grew up with. But there too, at least I had the benefit of being able to say, okay, like it's a new continuity, right? The timeline was changed in Flashpoint. This is a new version of the character. It doesn't match up with the version I grew up with, but it is what it is. But, so at least I had that. But with Hal Jordan, I was just thinking about that, the whole Soul War thing, just kind of got me thinking about what that must have been like,
it was demoralizing.
As a fan. Yeah.
It was demoralizing. It was, I mean, in some ways, to circle back to what we spoke about with Steve, one of the things I thought, well, this is great, but I can save a little bit of money. I got more room in my closet because now I don't have to keep buying Green Lantern.
Yeah. Did you ever become a Kyle fan?
Yeah. Not at first. I really think Jeff Johns, and it's interesting, right? Jeff Johns did the same thing with Doomsday Clock. He brought Clark's parents back into continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeff Johns really got things on track with Hal and Green Lantern Rebirth. And really, instead of erasing it, pretending it didn't occur, he leaned into it. And he really made the introduction of Parallax and the actions, the behaviors as Parallax part of the story, which I thought was smart. And then the other thing I thought was really smart was they let Hal and Kyle coexist. Hal kind of shook his hand and said, "Welcome aboard." Where other times they'll have, the one character be dead, and then the replacement is kind of viewed like, well, that's not my hero. Here they unified it a little bit. I think they set the stage where it wasn't, hey, the Silver Age guy is dead. Here's the modern era. They opened it up, and I think that was a smart move where they kind of set the stage where, hey, these guys are different. One's a test pilot, real impulsive, super confident. The other's an artist. So they really, I thought, did a good job with the personalities being a little bit different. And then later on, I thought they did a great job with, depending upon how you look at it, there were stories in certain books where Alan Scott would be with them. But more often you'd have John Stewart, Guy Gardner, Kyle, and Hal. I thought that was pretty intriguing. Each were very different in their approach to things.
Yeah, no, it's funny with Green Lantern Rebirth, and just to clarify, we're not talking about the 2016 line-wide Rebirth initiative, but we're talking about the Green Lantern Rebirth miniseries that restored Hal Jordan. And Jeff Johns accomplished a lot in those 6 issues as far as, explaining away, Hal's behavior, the fact that he had been infected with the living embodiment of fear. It wasn't that he turned evil. So as far as like continuity cleanup, he did a lot, but I really think the best part of that was that handshake. Yes. Between Hal and Kyle, because like you said, it would have been super, super easy to just kind of kick Kyle to the curb, and they didn't. And rather you got that handshake and gratitude from Hal to Kyle for carrying the torch. And I think for fans of both characters, it was a wonderful moment. And, going back to what you were saying before about, what we saw when they introduced Kyle, they stripped away so much of the elements of the Green Lantern mythos, and Kyle himself feels like such a reaction to Hal, right? Like where Hal at that point was the seasoned veteran with the white temples and all that. Like here you have a young kid, and as opposed to, Hal, who was always like this confident, like hotshot, fighter pilot, to have someone who's more like sensitive and artistic and insecure with the role, like it gave it a completely new flavor. But then I think that ultimately allowed for them to coexist even better, because it's not like they're kind of, playing the same dynamics. Like they're very different characters. And I think that allowed, created space for both of them to be there together.
Agreed. Yeah, very much agreed.
Now, so thank you for coming down this road with me. And I apologize for dredging up, angry memories of being a Green Lantern fan. But I have a little comics related surprise. And I want to jump back to something you said before about how, our first impressions of characters are so formative. And I've long felt that, and we've explored that on the podcast. Especially, I think even if you become a comics fan as an adult, I think this is at play, but especially if you're a kid, that first issue or that first, episode of a television show, whatever it is, like it is so informative. And I picked up something on eBay recently and I read it, and I'm going to hold it up to the screen. Again, listeners they can't see this, they're only hearing our conversation. But when I hold it up, would you please describe what it is, explain it for our listeners?
Sure. Oh my God, that was the first comic book I ever bought. World's Finest 143.
That's right.
Oh, I loved that book. I remember, different memories. I remember being really young and trying to get my dad to read that to me, and he wanted nothing to do with it. He goes, "Oh, that's garbage." But that was my, prior to that, Anthony, and we're going to get into this in the future, my whole experience with Superman was the TV show, the George Reeves Adventures of Superman, and they were in reruns then, because this was the early 1960s. But that was the first book, and I loved, that was my first introduction ever to Batman. I knew a lot about Superman from the TV show, but also Kurt Swan was the artist, and I think Sheldon Moldoff was the inker. But I just loved the whole mythos of Kendor and the whole Kryptonian background, and Nightwing and Flamebird. That issue has incredibly passionate, fervent memories, wonderful memories for me.
And that's why I wanted to experience it.
Surprise me?
Yeah, well, I wanted to experience it for myself. Again, I knew we would have no problem filling an hour on this podcast. We have plenty to talk about. And, it's actually funny because one of the main, and I've talked about this before, but one of the main reasons I wanted to do this LongAR Halloween series was to catch up with the AR gang, right? And, in the first two episodes, I had conversations with Bill and Roby, and it's like, I don't talk to them on a regular basis. And a lot of the people coming up on subsequent episodes fall into that same category. You were very much an outlier because we have basically weekly phone calls, which I treasure, and especially, I always have, but especially in these months of quarantine, it's really been wonderful to be able to connect like that. So,
amen. I echo that back. I definitely reciprocate on that.
But so I knew filling an hour, like we always have stuff to talk about, but I was just thinking, I was like, well, what, especially whether it's AR related or comics related, it's like, what could I bring to this that might be a little bit different? And, I knew this was your first issue, and I double checked by, queuing up the opening moments of My Comic Shop documentary, because in my original movie, it opens with the AR gang talking about their first comics, right? And then that, of course, leads everyone to alternate realities. And so I just confirmed the issue number, that it was World's Finest 143, cover dated August 1964. And I tracked it. I first looked to see if it was available digitally. It was not, or at least not anywhere that I could find. So I tracked down the actual issue in decent condition, I must say, on eBay, because I just was curious. Again, I know what my first comic meant to me, and the idea that this meant the same to you. It's like, well, I want to know the story that got Rich into comics. And let me first ask, do you still own a copy?
I don't have the original one that I purchased. I think my dad threw it out during, like, when they were recycling newspapers or stuff. He would do that periodically, not maliciously or in a punitive fashion, but God forbid my brother and I inadvertently left him laying around, and he was like getting all the old magazines, and it just got caught in the wake. But I did repurchase it. More for fondness, just to say, I've got it. And my memory is, I'm trying to do the math on this. I think that's about a 24 or 25 page story. And my memory is that early on, Superman goes to help Batman and Robin, and the criminals, the robbers or whomever, shoot bullets at Superman. They bounce off him because he's invulnerable, but one of the bullets catches Bruce. And I can remember, like you spoke about the experience you and your father had when he would read certain stories to you, and you got so enthralled with, the death of Superman. I can remember my first exposure to Batman and Robin and just being stunned, like, who the hell's this guy? And his costume is kind of a counterpart to Superman's, with the insignia and the cape and the outside pants, but I was just the Batcave. So many things just flooded back. And then also that's when I learned, holy cow, about Krypton and the Bottle City of Kandor and the whole myth of the Kryptonian society and civilization and stuff like that. So, I good memories. Good memories.
And so you do currently own a copy of it then?
Yes.
You do. All right. I was going to offer you this, but now we each have one, so even better. And so you knew who Superman was by watching Adventures of Superman, right? But this was your exposure to Batman. So was this, was your knowledge of Superman by watching the George Reeves TV series? Is that why you were drawn to this particular comic on the newsstand?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I noticed on there was Superman. And then I was wondering who the other guy was. But what's interesting, and your listeners, my apologies. Poor Anthony is hanging out with an old man, but the TV show, when I watched it in the early 1960s, it was always black and white. I mean, I think the later seasons they filmed in color, but even color TVs were a rarity back then. So I grew up watching reruns of the TV show The Adventures of Superman. And Anthony, we'll get more into this, and I'm thrilled I'll be on my game. But the Superman in that book that you're reading, or you just held up, personality, he's a little more patient than the Superman we know from the 1950s TV show.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick tease. So Rich is going to be my guest on a pair of upcoming episodes of Digging for Kryptonite that'll air early 2021. We're going to be, I think, be a pretty deep dive into the 1950s George Reeves Adventures of Superman television series. And whether you're familiar with it or not, I think you'll enjoy our conversation about it. I'm really excited. We've been talking about it off mic for a while now. And I'm excited to record. And yes, the Superman in that show is, and the Clark in particular, is very decisive and can be impatient at times. So yeah, a bit divorced from what you see in this comic. But you described the initial the opening of World's Finest 143, where, like you said, Superman is helping Batman. The crooks fire bullets. One bounces off and hits Batman. But so this was and again, I had never read the story before. I didn't know anything about it other than, what you had shared. And obviously I saw the cover, so I had a basic idea, but it was fascinating to read. So after Batman gets wounded, he develops an inferiority complex. I mean, I don't know how long it's been since you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I can easily go through it.
Go for it.
He gets totally consumed with self-doubt and like, I could die. This is too dangerous. The inferiority complex, consumed with self-doubt and ineffective.
He's so down on himself. It was so fascinating to read a Batman just devoid of confidence. I mean, he was so down on himself. Like he felt he didn't deserve a spot on the Batman Superman team. He felt he was just a liability. It was mind blowing to see that version of Batman.
Right. And then I think Superman and Jimmy come up with this plan. Hey, we need to do something to reignite his self-confidence and reawaken his value and his importance. So they come up with this ruse that, and here's the backdrop. And again, even for me, this is how I learned about the Fortress of Solitude. And, I knew who Jimmy Olsen was, but they come up with this ruse where there's an emergency in the bottle city of Kendor, which is, a remnant of Krypton, a full city that was miniaturized by Brainiac. And there were some, as I recall, there were some ancient villains or criminals, bank robbers, whatever, but they had these special clamps that would turn them into like a living metal creatures, like a la Colossus from the X-Men.
Yeah, like the Metalloids, I think they were.
Metalloids or Ferrolad, where they just became a gray metal shell and just invulnerable to anything but, Metalloids. So the air quotes, the ruse was, hey, we'll take Batman down there. I'll pretend that, I'm Superman. They knock me out. He's got to jump in and save me. And I do think somewhere in there was something where they go through this, but somehow someone, instead of instead of doing it in a benign fashion, the Metalloid, they really become evil and destructive, and they're out to kill Superman. And I remember something where I think certain trees get knocked down, and they had to climb over a ravine to escape. The Metalloids couldn't do it, but Batman was able to get Superman over to the other side of the ravine, over these fallen trees. And then I think Jimmy says something stupid like, holy cow, he kind of lets the cat out of the bag, and then Batman's all insulted, like, hey, you deceived me. You were, just jerking my chain. So he's about to storm off and go back to Earth. And I do think that Superman was injured, and then Batman steps in. He becomes a Metalloid. Between he and Robin, they take out. I forget how it enacted. Someone overheard, there was a scientist.
Yeah, because Superman had an ally in the Bottle City, and that was who he reached out to create this ruse. And there was another actor who overheard this and usurped the plan and used the Metalloid technology for evil instead of this ruse. But it's super fun, no pun intended. It's really funny because there are all these sequences where Superman's like, hey, they're really making this look like very real. And then he's like, hey, they're taking this too far. It takes him a while before he realizes something's truly amiss. So that aspect of it was really funny. And then of course there's, the cover of the book is Batman and Superman dueling. And we do get that in the pages as well. Cause Superman doesn't have his powers here. So, he and Batman have this duel. It was, again, the thing that jumped out the most was I've just never seen Batman depicted in that way. And in fairness, I've read hardly any pre-Crisis Batman other than probably Crisis on Infinite Earths. Barely any. So I don't really have any frame of reference for pre-Crisis Batman, and maybe that accounts for it. But either way, yeah, that jumped out at me the most, was just how out of character to me Batman felt, being so down on himself. And then the other thing, and I don't know where I land on this, on the one hand, as far as Superman's whole plan, there's something, deeply kind and considerate and compassionate about it, right? He wants to help his friend. He wants to give him his self-confidence back, but there's so much deception, and it almost feels like, I don't know, condescending or patronizing, that he invents this whole thing just to try to make him feel better. I don't know. Where do you
You know what I got to say? That, quite frankly, was really the tenor of the times. There were a lot of stories in the Silver Age, definitely more so Superman stories, where he would really do kind of deceitful things or confusing things, whether it be to Jimmy Olsen or Lois Lane or Lana Lang. Really, the editors at that time were very, very misogynistic. And it was almost like, hey, women are second-class citizens. So they would really play mind games with Lois and Lana. And even if you look at some of the covers, I think Bill, there's a website that really talks about all the jerk actions Superman takes in the Silver Age. Like he adopts Jimmy and then he kicks him to the curb. And, but there was always some very, very, very intricate, almost unimaginable thing like, there's some space aliens that through their telescope, we're just going to deceive them for this. That's why I had to treat you like crap, Jimmy. So it was the tenor of the times, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense. I guess, I don't know. It was hard for me to put my finger on it as I was reading it, but as we're talking about it, I guess like that version of Superman, just, it feels like he's more removed from the human experience, that he's more detached and he's sort of like playing with people's emotions like that, even if it's well-intentioned in the case of the World's Finest issue. I guess that's sort of like what it makes me feel reading it. But yeah, it was fascinating. I'm glad I was able to find it. I got it on eBay, and so I'm glad I can say like the comic that got you into comics, your first one, like I've read, and I definitely enjoyed it, in its own way.
Well, yeah. You just there's another thought that's kind of percolating and coming to the top of my head. It was the tenor of the times. But then also, if I may, this was really, like just less than 10 years after Wortham, with all the congressional hearings and how comics are so destructive, and they plant bad ideas in people, in young boys' minds. So the comic code came out. And then the other thing is, it was really only Marvel that started doing continuing stories. If you look back at DC back in the early 60s, everything was done in one, because there were no distribution shops. And in some ways, there was no appreciation for continuity. So these things were written for 10-year-olds. But I do think it was just reflective of the time in which it occurred. And I think it's common. If you were to browse some other covers from World's Finest, there's a lot of those mysterious, like, oh, hey, I got to hide this from Batman. Like he uses his X-ray vision to burn a message, destroy it so Batman doesn't see it. I think some of it, candidly, was kind of the tease of the cover as well.
Gotcha. And so as far as the comics buying experience itself, so this was early 60s. So were you still living in Illinois at the time?
Yes. Yeah.
Because we've talked about how, we've numerous times we've recounted your first meeting with Odo when you moved to White Plains, New York, when you were in high school. But so at this point in time, you were still in Illinois, and this was like a rural area, right?
Yeah.
Or more suburban?
It was a small village. Okay. It was about, I would say, a half an hour train ride from downtown Chicago.
Oh, okay.
But how should I say it? Society was totally different then. I mean, Kennedy had just died. I remember that. And I can remember bringing that comic you just held up home. And that really birthed my comic buying experience, because prior to then, if one of the, there was no one in my neighborhood who read comics. I was an outlier. I was in isolation. So the only time I would ever get to see a comic would be if my dad went to a barber shop and there was some on one of the side tables. That was the only exposure I got. Then that, that really did stimulate. Superman in the 60s was a big one to buy. World's Finest was big. Justice League. But boy, oh boy, I can remember being God forbid there was a two-parter and you didn't get that second one. I was at the mercy of the guy in the pharmacy. Do they let them stay up on the spinner or do they throw them out?
Yeah, I'm always fascinated when we talk about, that period of time before there were, comic book specialty shops, because, yeah, you really were contending with a very unreliable newsstand distribution system. Like, you didn't know, you got World's Finest 143. You didn't know if they would carry 144, the next month. And where was it specifically? Where was this newsstand? Was it at a train station?
So, yes,
yeah.
You've got a superb memory. Yes, it was at the train station in the village I grew up in. And it was a newsstand for all practical purposes. And I forget. I truly think what had happened is I remember walking into the village. It was maybe a half a mile walk with my mother. She wanted to go into a card store and get some cards. It took longer than expected, so she bought me that as a reward for me just hanging out. So fond memories, but boy, that was the spark that lit everything. Where now, effectively 55 years later, I'm still talking about it.
Well, I'm glad that you had that exposure. We might not be friends. We might not never have known each other or, had that meeting about JLA Spectre Soul War, had it not been for that. So I'm glad, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it. We began this episode by talking about, as we wind down here, we started by talking about, the routine that you used to have as far as coming to alternate realities between Christmas and New Year's. Sadly that routine went away right when the store did, but we sort of created a new one with that New Year's Day brunch, which, fortunately this year we won't be able to have, but I'm sure we'll return the year after, hopefully.
And we also, the holiday dinners, they would, I remember last year we had a big turnout, almost 20 people or something.
That was the one I organized, but then I was sick and I didn't make it.
You were sick.
But I'm glad it happened. So all these traditions that sort of, again, certainly this year in particular has thrown a lot off, but between the closing of the store and now the pandemic, I know, routines are still off, but I'm so glad that, we've kept in touch. And in the first episode of the LongAR Halloween, Bill and we talked about how honored we are to be on your call list on the weekends. And I won't, I don't want to sort of even try to peek behind the curtain too much. So I won't ask many questions, but I guess, what did I want to ask? Oh, like over a given weekend, roughly how many calls are you making?
I'd say easily 8 or 9 or 10
over the 2 days.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's, and that's not nothing. And, it's because, having had all these phone conversations with you, it's like, it's not dissimilar from like hosting a podcast or something like that. And I know, like, if I do 2 episodes in a row, I'm like, okay, I need a break now. So, for you to have all these phone calls and I know because I have them with you, it's like, I know how engaged you are. I mean, that's, that's really something. And I know, we enjoy it. I know you enjoy it. Are they, because obviously like we know, like, those of us who kind of get the call every weekend, is it always a set list or are there kind of like floaters? Like, are there some people who will get a call like every other week or once a month or is it really like a set list every weekend?
There are certain absolute calls I make every weekend. And there are some others, I love my Uncle Bob and my cousin Charlie, but I might call them every 3 or 4 weeks. And then some of my nephews. Now, the most baffling thing is I cannot tell you the number of Sundays when all of a sudden I realize, holy shit, it's 6:00 at night. I got to make dinner. But I burnt maybe 6 hours in phone calls between noon and 6 p.m. It just, I get on the things and you and I chat for, conceivably 45 minutes. Same thing with Bill. Now, we were really getting into impromptu podcast preps for Superman. And I urge your listeners to listen to us, because by tremendous good fortune and serendipity, you and I both watched the very origin story from 1952 or 53, almost the same weekend. And that would have been lightning in a bottle if we had recorded that, because we were so jazzed and so amped up. But all these calls, every phone call I'll make, it's a good 45 minutes each call. And especially with COVID, it's keeping me sane.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And again, for myself as well, as much as, I have my wife and my son, so like I have plenty of company here, but, to just be able to, engage in a different way and, talk about, stuff like this, and catch up with you I always enjoy it. Just as far as like ritual habits, like that sort of thing. One thing that I'm actually kind of worried about with you is we've spoken many times about how firm a handshake you have. And I was thinking about this. It's like, Rich hasn't been able to shake hands for almost a year. Do you think that you've lost any power, or have you been building it up? Like, is your handshake going to be even more crushing than before? Have you thought about this at all?
I haven't thought about it, but I'm probably going to get one of those vice grips to start working out to prepare for re-entry once a vaccine's around. No, I haven't. I didn't see that coming by way of a question.
Well, I was thinking, I was like, I'm right, out of all of the things that we haven't been able to do, because I was thinking about, not being able to come in for the New Year's brunch and things like that. But it's like, yeah, just shaking hands. Because again, as we've always talked about, you have but I do feel like it's worth mentioning, right? Because we always joke about your handshake, but I want listeners to be clear. Like, there's nothing, it's not like Rich is purposely trying to hurt anyone's hand. Like, he's not, I think this is important because it's like, you're not making, or at least I don't think, you're not making a show of it. It's not like, hey, I'm going to show you how. It's just, it's innate. And again, it's not like it wouldn't hurt anybody. And I feel like if you were shaking hands with someone who you really knew couldn't take it, you would hold back a little bit. Is that something like that your dad taught you from an early age, like a firm handshake, look people in the eye? Or is that something that you kind of developed when you entered the business world, or somewhere in between?
I think I definitely both. My sister reminded me of this. But my dad always said, whenever you meet someone, give them a good handshake and look them in the eye and introduce yourself and get their name and treat them with respect. Now, I had forgotten that, but boy, I don't know. And it's not something I try to do. It's innate. It's natural. I'll try to do this justice, but I'm fuzzy on this. But must have been pushing on 12 and a half years ago. My father passed away, and Drew and Steve and Bill Mayo all came up and attended the ceremony. And it warmed my heart. I mean, Drew was working in Manhattan. He drove out to where they were and then drove back to work. But Bill came up, I think, from Baltimore, and that blew my mind. And I remember that late that night, I finally got back home alone, and I called a number of people and expressed my thanks. I called Steve, and I called Drew, and I called Bill. And as soon as I called Bill, I said, "You'll never guess what Steve said when I called him." He goes, "I'll tell you what he said. He said, you have the weakest handshake of all your brothers, right? Or every, And I go, how did you know that? Because it freaked me out. Steve's first comment, is, "Hey, you got the weakest handshake of all your brothers." And I said, "Bill, how did you know that?" And he goes, "Are you kidding me? That's all he spoke about in the drive home." It was like an hour and 20-minute drive home. But Steve was so wound up on that.
I know. No, I heard it as well. Because I do remember this. I think I watched the store that day when they all went. And I remember Steve sharing that when he came back. Because I don't know, I'm sure we've said this before, but just to reiterate, because I was reflecting on the power of the handshake, and I really think, obviously the grip strength is there for sure, but it really is that step you take a step forward, like you step into the handshake. And I think that's where you really build up that momentum and it transfers to the hand. And I think that's like I think that's what puts it over the top. Now, if you didn't take that step, it would still be a more than respectable, more than firm handshake. Like, I'm not trying to take anything away from the grip, but I think really what puts you into another category is that step. It's the step into it. But, it certainly, is something that obviously has made an impression on all of us. And it's something that, I've tried to carry forward. And, it's funny, like I meet a lot of people in my capacity as a law school admissions officer. It's like I meet a lot of people, prospective students, and and I know there are some people who, if you have like any sort of physical or social condition where you can't shake hands, I'm not including you in this, but generally speaking, you can tell a lot about someone, I think, by the way, they introduce themselves. Not even not so much the strength of their grip, but is it a firm handshake? Are they making eye contact? You really can.
We're moving into Ron Swanson territory now.
Yeah. But no, it's, it's always interesting to me. So, again, I'm sure that, I don't know. In my mind, I was thinking, that you might have lost a step, as a result of not being able to shake hands. But I don't know. As we're talking about it, I feel like it might be that you've gone the other direction and you've built up all this like pent up handshake power. And the next person who gets a handshake better have some ice on hand afterwards.
Well, it's a sad commentary. Who knows when I'll be shaking hands again, right? I think even with the vaccine, I think it's going to be, I think masks and some of the social distancing things are going to last with us for a while. So I might be doing a fist bump or an elbow,
Well, I think it would be a stretch if like handshakes never came back, but you never know. And I know there's been talk of some of these things like along the way during the pandemic of, are there certain social conventions that might go away, once we're obviously certainly now, but even once we're past this, and you do kind of wonder like handshakes, like now everyone has gone a year without shaking hands. It's like, might that be something that sort of falls away? I don't think so. But you never know.
You never know. You never know. I didn't see that coming by in terms of a segment of discussion.
I know. Well, between that and surprising you with the comic, I try to keep you on your toes. But I figure it's all good fun stuff. It's all in good fun. So we've been talking for about an hour and a half. I think this is a good point to sort of wrap up. But as always, thank you for coming on and doing this. I know I just said it a moment ago, but I really, the phone calls that we have, I enjoy so much. And I can't wait until we record our episodes of Digging for Kryptonite. That's really going to be a lot of fun. Those we'll be recording shortly, so we'll, be doing it virtually like this. But, I certainly look forward to the day when I can have you over to the brand new Flat Squirrel Studios and actually do one of these things face to face. And when we can have one of our dinners all as a group again, it'll be great. But, in the meantime, I'm so glad that, we've been able to keep in touch and that you're staying safe and healthy.
I echo that back. I thank you for this. I thank you. Give my best to Steph and Milo. Extend my best wishes. And I urge the listeners to come in when Anthony and I get to discuss the Adventures of Superman for the 1950s. Candidly, both of us, I think, immersed ourselves in this. There was a synergy. Each of our interests fed the other. And I've watched more of these episodes than I ever planned to do so. And I'm getting more out of it. I'm really peeling the layers of the onion back. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
I know I've plugged it a few times, but really, for anyone listening to this, if you like listening to me and you like listening to Rich and, and certainly if you're interested in Superman, I really do encourage you to check out Digging for Kryptonite. We have a few episodes that are out already. And then again, the Adventures of Superman ones with Rich, that'll be coming early in 2021. But, exactly what you were saying, I've heard this now, I think from every person I've had on the show as a guest, because we've been talking about various comics runs and movies and things like that. And everyone has kind of said like they've appreciated the opportunity to have a reason to revisit the material and to engage with it in a different way. because it's really true. And I certainly know this personally. It's like, reading or watching something for fun is one thing, and that's great. But when you're consuming it, knowing that you're going to be analyzing it and discussing it, it's like you really do engage with it in a different way. And I think you get something different out of it. So I felt the same about, watching Adventures of Superman. It's like, even if I were just binging it for fun, like I would enjoy it. But, knowing that like, I'm going to talk to Rich about this and we'll record an episode, like it really just adds this whole other dimension to it.
Eminently well said. Eminently well said. Yeah, I can't wait to discuss the different episodes and share our comments. But as you said, this is not a doubting, sensitive. This guy is, no nonsense, this Superman. So I heard if people are interested in the different portrayals and different renditions, George Reeves set a pretty hard bar.
For sure. Well, thank you again, Rich. Thank you to all of our listeners. I hope that everyone has a safe and healthy and happy holiday. We'll be back with the next installment of the LongAR Halloween in early January. My guest will be Doug Desher, who hasn't been on the show in probably a few years, so it'll be fun to catch up with him. And until then, don't be a flat squirrel. My Comic Shop History is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Philtastic Phil Menza, music by Basic Printer. If you like what you heard, be sure to listen to Digging for Kryptonite, available on most major podcast platforms. Sign up for exclusive content at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato and watch My Comic Shop Country, out now on Apple TV and Amazon.